pretty consistently bench over 300 pounds.
Chisanga Malata of the Sun here with a man who needs no introduction if you're into your powerlifting and bodybuilding like myself. I'm talking about the one, the only Stan the Rhino Efferding. Stan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to speak to you. Obviously, we're here to talk about mixed martial arts and your involvement with Jon Jones. But as I said at the top of the introduction, there a lot of people might not know your background. I myself, a big weightlifting fan for many years, and so for the people who might not know who you are, just give yourself like a little introduction.
Yeah, I started out as a skinny little wrestler in high school, 98 pounds, 106 as a junior. I only weighed 115 as a senior. And so when I finally got to college, I had a soccer scholarship and I was undersized. I was a monstrous 135 as a freshman in college, 135 pounds. What is that in kilos? About 60 kilos?
About that, yes.
Yeah, not a large guy. So I just started weightlifting to try and bulk up so I could have some more size for soccer. And I fell in love with it. And so I started competing in bodybuilding and powerlifting and studied exercise science and started coaching athletes at the University of Oregon for football and track and just have made a career of it. Obviously, competitively becoming an IFBB pro bodybuilder and then world record powerlifter, having bulked up to over 300 pounds oftentimes throughout my career to become a powerlifter and then dieting down to single digit body fat. And then working with a lot of athletes over the years, just focusing on performance, of course, and coaching high school, collegiate, and professional athletes. You mentioned more recently working with Jon Jones. We just started getting Henry Cejudo ready for his next fight, and presumably in April. NFL football players like Lane Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles, and then some of the world's strongest men like Hafthor Bjornsson, Mountain from Game of Thrones, four-time world's strongest man, Brian Shaw, and just a host of other great athletes I've had the opportunity to work with. And so that's kind of my history and how I've gotten to where I'm at. I'm 55 years old now and still training hard as I can and trying to use all the lessons that I learned throughout my career to help my athletes now.
And one thing I wanted to ask you about that, because I've seen photos and videos of you in your prime and your powerlifting and both bodybuilding. How did you find the transition, like going back constantly between the two? Because obviously with powerlifting, aesthetics is at the absolute bottom of the list when it comes to it. But then transitioning back to bodybuilding, it's at the top. How did you find balancing the two?
Well, I wanted to be a pro bodybuilder, and the heavy lifting was born out of my misunderstanding at the time, back in the early 90s, that the stronger I got, the bigger I would get. And in fact, that's not the case. It took me many years to figure that out. And of course, now we train bodybuilders and powerlifters much differently. But I ended up liking lifting heavy weights, and I also ended up liking the aesthetics of bodybuilding. And so plus, I became a little bit burned out on each sport. As you would train and compete for it, it became, it was a lot. It's pretty overwhelming to try and compete at the highest levels. So transitioning back and forth throughout my career really kind of kept things interesting for me. And I learned a lot of lessons that I apply to my athletes now. If it's strongmen or powerlifters, I don't let them lift heavy all year round. The greatest powerlifter of all time, Eddie Cohn, only competed in powerlifting twice a year. And in the off season, he would do hypertrophy training. It helped obviously build a foundation for all of his success. And the same thing would be true, say, with athletes. I don't want them, to be just focused on their skills all year round. There has to be some time in there where they can focus on increasing their performance, their strength, and their power in particular, which is, of course, expressing force over a time component. And so those are the things that I try and do is separate optimal training for the best results and not trying to. I think there was a phase there we went through where people were trying to kind of combine everything into these sports specific style training programs. And you don't get the best of either doing it that way.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned obviously training with Jon Jones, and you mentioned Henry Cejudo, but you're not new to mixed martial arts. And in fact, I remember it must have been about 10 or 11 years ago. one of my friends went to UFC 143, and it was Diaz versus Condit, and he told me that he thought he saw you in the crowd. He wasn't 100% sure if it was you. Can you confirm if it was you? Were you indeed at that fight?
Yeah, I've been following, UFC fighting for many, many years. Attended lots of their shows here in Vegas. I live here now in Vegas and have for about the last 11 years, but I used to fly down and attend all of them. I worked with professional boxers for a number of years prior to the UFC becoming more popular. Trainers, they generally would just use the strength coach at the gym.
Okay, okay. And moving on to the main topic of this interview, your work with Jon Jones. How did this come about? Because when I saw this, I think it was just a throwaway Instagram post that you put you in there, and then I was like, is that Stan Efferding in the background? And lo and behold, I clicked on the tag, of course it was you. So talk to me about how your training came to be.
Mine with Jon Jones.
Correct. Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, uh, actually, it was through Mark Bell. Mark Bell
Okay.
met Jon Jones and said, "Hey, who's doing your diet?" It kind of started mostly as diet because I had done a lot of diet work for a lot of pro athletes. And when Jon wanted to move up to heavyweight, he reached out to me to do his diet for him first initially, and then I went down there and worked out with him. And obviously, I'm well qualified as a strength and conditioning coach, and so we looked at a few things and did a few things, and he liked what I had to offer and brought the coach. He has a conditioning coach. He has his sport specific coaches. So I was just another. I just contributed to that whole camp. I don't want to, I don't want anybody to think that any one person is more important than the other. Obviously, being at Jackson Wink and having those coaches that he's worked, and Jon is a he's kind of a student of the sport and athletics in general. So he's always reaching out to try and get more information to incorporate the best of everything he can into his camp.
Okay, and you've come across many, many athletes during your time, powerlifting, bodybuilding, and as a coach. Where would you rank Jon in terms of the athletes that you've trained or worked along with?
Oh goodness, I mean he's certainly the most talented. Jon's one of those guys who, in a very short period of time, and progresses extremely quickly. For instance, we go in, one of the first things we do is we try and find weaknesses. A lot of athletes, they do the exercises that they're best at. And so we do a comprehensive evaluation and try and find the exercises that they're bad at, meaning that their strength in that area is not where it could be or should be for an athlete of their caliber. In Jon's case, it was posterior chain, and that's pretty common, to be honest with you. Glutes and hamstrings don't get the attention that they need, and those are hip. So those help you get under an athlete when you're just. And so we got him started on doing those things. Glute ham raises, in particular, was one of the hamstring exercises that we were done. And just within a few short 20, it's phenomenal how quickly.
And you said initially you were brought in to help Jon with his diet. I'm assuming you put him on the vertical diet, right?
Yeah, and the vertical diet really is just kind of goes down the basics. Obviously, Jon's goal was to gain weight, and so let's start from the top. Calories are king. We had to get him into a calorie surplus.
Mm-hmm.
Easier said than done because a lot of times people have a hard time consuming all the calories that they need, especially the quality of calories that you need to gain muscle and not fat. And secondly, after calories is, of course, the macros, and we wanted to get him sufficient protein, about a gram of protein per pound of lean weight. So he was fighting at 220, and he would he was about 240 when I got a hold of him, and we brought him up to about 260 over the course of the many months that I was there. So we did about 220 grams of protein a day, and then after that, we're looking at micronutrients, and athletes, they burn through a lot of micronutrients. And for performance, we like to look at electrolytes, minerals, and electrolytes. So, sufficient potassium, sodium, magnesium, calcium, and we get those from food. Potassium-rich foods are potatoes. There's twice as much potassium as bananas. Fruit, yogurt, and yogurt has the extra benefit of being high in calcium. And we, based on his training, we would then salt meals accordingly, because if you lose weight during a training session, you want to replace and rehydrate that. And so we would do that with, just a rehydration drink. For every kilogram of weight he lost, we'd want to give him about 1.5 liters of water with a 5 or 6% glucose solution, or actually a blend of dextrose and fructose. It's easier to tolerate, for the stomach to tolerate, along with about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per liter. And so we would titrate that, because he would train twice a day. So we'd want to get, him rehydrated and carved back up after the morning training session. So his evening session, he had energy to perform as well. And so that kind of takes you through calories, macros, and micros. Meal frequency, we shot for about 4 meals a day. There's no mechanism to store protein, so we kind of want to get evenly spaced meals throughout the day. And then beyond that, we're just trying for compliance. We're trying to make sure that he has the system in place, whether his wife was cooking or he had prep meals. I own a meal prep company where I distribute meals nationwide, and so it was easy for me to send him meals from the vertical diet that he'd have in his freezer, so they were convenient. When we traveled, I would put meals into a thermos, and so that I had a hot meal available when he was supposed to eat. We tried to stay on a schedule if we could. But at the same time, we don't want to be too stringent. John's, he wants to be able to eat things that are kind of outside of a rigid plan, and we plan for that as well. And so I would find some of the restaurants that he liked to frequent, and I would pull up the menus and then try and pick the menu choices that would best fit his diet. And usually for that, and for like high school kids who are often traveling for sports, we just go for a 2-to-1 protein to fat ratio. Just try and pick something off the menu that's high in protein, moderate fat, and then sufficient carbohydrates. The problem with weight gain is if you get too much fat, then the likelihood that you're going to add fat at a greater rate than what would be necessary or reasonable, optimal, is higher. I like to keep the fats a little lower. For instance, if we gave him 220 grams of protein, I'd like to do about half that in fats, about 110 grams of fats, maybe. Somewhere less than 30% of total calories, I should say. And then the balance of that would be carbohydrates, what I call the rest. So once I fix his protein intake, say at 200 grams, that's 800 calories. And then I fix his fat intake at 100 grams, that's 900 calories. So that's 1,700 calories that are fixed. And then the rest are carbs, and the rest is really based on how many calories does he need to eat to maintain a 500 calorie surplus, and that would be based on his basal metabolic rate and his daily workload. And so if he needs, say, 4,200 calories, and I've got 1,700 accounted for in proteins or fats, then the other 2,400 calories or so, 2,500 calories need to come from carbs. So if it's 2,500 or 2,400 calories, that's going to be about 600 grams of carbs. And we'll break those up into 4 meals, or about 150 grams of carbs per meal. I hope I didn't go through that too fast, but that's really a very specific breakdown of exactly what I design. And we just try and get as close to that as possible. It's not magic, and it has to be something that we can comply with. And that's how we set it up. And then, of course, the first carbs, the foundation of carbs, start with the high potassium carbs, the potato, the fruit, maybe some fiber in there with some oatmeal. And then we'll quickly transition to easily digestible carbs. And white rice is my preference for that, because he does have to eat a lot of calories. And so I can't have him overburdened with hard to digest foods and being bloated and gassy all the time.
So no, I appreciate you going so in depth with that. And now in terms of calories, How much was he consuming? Because obviously he had to be in a caloric surplus, but obviously it's mixed martial arts training and just even in general weightlifting, you burn through a ton of calories. So what if you
Yeah,
could remember how many calories a day was he eating?
we were shooting before between 4,000 and 4,500.
Mhm.
And the 4,500 would be on train on high fatigue training days where he was training twice a day, and the 4,000 to 4,200 might be, say, on the weekends or his days off or days that he only did one low fatigue session, because we broke his days up into high fatigue and low fatigue. We can get into his training next, but that's how I designed the diet.
And I'm assuming you had one high fatigue day and one low fatigue day. So you wouldn't have run the risk of overtraining it. So like almost stacking it, if you know what I mean.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly what we do. We stack the daily fatigue. And I think that if you're going to, people might assume differently, but if you're going to have a really heavy weight training day, you also want to have the most fatiguing workout that day, whether it's going live on wrestling or kickboxing. And then if you're going to have, say, a speed day where you're doing mostly concentric explosive work and not a lot of burdensome, eccentric heavy loading, then you do your jujitsu on that day or your pads, for boxing. And that's how we would break up low fatigue and high fatigue.
Okay, fair enough. And did you guys? I know you said you focus a lot on his posterior chain, but did you put a lot of focus on the big three lifts as well with Jon, or?
But with Jon, yeah, because he actually enjoyed them. Jon liked to lift. Had been lifting down there for some time, and he had a huge deadlift. He's already deadlifting over 500 pounds. The problem is that his the deadlift's more of a hip hinge. It's more quad, really, coming off the floor. His lockout was a little, I don't want to use the word weak, but it could have been better. And so that's kind of one of the ways we identified the posterior chain deficiency. He liked to squat, he liked to deadlift, and he liked to bench. Jon was unique in that way. He wanted to do the hardest stuff. Our challenge was trying not to create too much fatigue during those sessions, because Jon's one of those guys, when he gets into the gym, he goes 110%. And there's just no quitting in the guy. And so you actually have to kind of hold him back or design a program that causes less fatigue, but is still challenging. The way we do that is, say, mostly concentric movements. Say on the squat, we'll use a box. So he doesn't have to, and we might put the box a little bit high. It's not, a bodybuilder would want the greatest range of motion, but an athlete like Jon, he's never going to be in that position, in that range to where he's going to need to be strong at 90 degrees. If you're at 90 degrees in a UFC match, you're losing the fight. So so we can adjust that to where he's only at 60 degrees or so, and that's where he's actually going to be. I think most of the time when he's going to do a takedown or when he's diving in for a jab or something like that. And so we would do box squats with a somewhat higher box. And it also takes away the need to redirect the weight. So you're getting rid of some of that eccentric stress. So you're doing less damage, less fatigue, breakdown in the muscles, but you're still getting the benefit of of progressing the concentric portion of the movement. We did the same thing for hamstrings. We would do some good mornings, but we would do them into the chains or straps, however you set it up, so that when you brought the bar down, you would just drop it into the straps. And then you would do the concentric motion of a good morning. You would do the concentric motion and then kind of just let it crash down. It's interesting how when we posted some of those workouts, of course, the ne'er-do-wells on social media were whining about, they were whining about both the range of motion and the fact that we set up chains to eliminate the eccentric portion of the movement. But it's for a very specific reason. You don't want to over fatigue these athletes, because their goal is to be able to fight, and all we need to do is provide a sufficient stimulus to give them the added strength, so they have increased force production. And then we also have to touch the power component, so that it's not just strength, but it's power, and that strength has a speed component, and strength speed is power. And so we would add in things like some box jumps. We used an overspeed treadmill. You may have seen some video of Jon running 20 miles an hour on an overspeed treadmill, which is also excellent for hip extension. We do that preferably over, say, downhill running, which would be huge eccentric loads, because it's a kind of a braking force. Even running on a track, is very stressful and creates a lot of fatigue because only the first 15, maybe 20 yards, 20 meters is concentric, and then the rest is kind of a decelerating braking force, and eccentric. Just the body is the quadriceps are kind of braking, decelerating. So we have to be cautious about that. We couldn't even run them on a track. And the neat thing about the overspeed treadmill is you only run for 6 seconds and then you just grab the handles and jump off. You don't have to slow down. And it's the slowing down that creates the majority of the fatigue. We saw a lot of like wheelbarrow walks and sled drags and forward and back sled drags. Again, mostly concentric. He was able to do some pretty substantial lifting. Chest supported rows instead of bent over rows. It's just less stress on the lumbar spine, which just accumulates less fatigue on the body. And that's how we kept him fresh and progressed him to get stronger, but didn't adversely impact his MMA fighting.
And you talked about his newly acquired strength. How do you foresee that translating, carrying it through into the octagon?
Well, I mean, obviously the big thing would be in the grappling, but also the takedowns. I mentioned that his hip extension, his power, his ability to get up under on a takedown is much faster now, and so it's going to be really hard to defend against that. So all of those things, anytime you get stronger or more powerful, I should say, strength with speed, you're going to run faster, jump higher, throw further. Especially in the hips, we did a lot of medicine ball work as well, so we could get the rotational power, which translates into better punching strength. That's where that comes from. It comes from the hips, doesn't come from the arms. And so, we tried to do that in a progressive fashion by loading. We did some real wide sumo deadlifts to help with the hips, and then we actuated that with the medicine ball work.
Mm-hmm. And I'm conscious of time. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions. I appreciate the time today. If you were to hazard a guess, how much do you think Jon's going to weigh on fight night?
Well, the last 6 weeks of training is pretty intense. So I think he's going to be around 240, which is what I predicted when we first got together. But he'll be stronger at that weight than what he was 2 years ago when we started with him, significantly stronger. And what we said from the get-go is that Jon could get as heavy as he wanted so long as his performance wasn't impaired. We saw this with, say, Bastius Alexi at the Olympics when he was lifting. The coaches would say, look, if as long as you're getting stronger, we don't care how heavy you get. But as soon as you lose, and the way we measured that initially was with his broad jump. And if his broad jump was continuing to increase, then the weight didn't matter. Last thing we want to do is put some weight on him that caused him to be slower or for him to perform worse. And so those are the things that we measure. Those were the metrics that we used to make sure that the body weight that was going on him was good weight that was going to be productive in the ring.
And that leads me to one of my penultimate questions. We've seen a lot of athletes in the history of combat sports go away, put on a lot of size, and then it's almost to their detriment. Do you think the fact that Jon has taken so much time, nearly 3 years to do this slowly, will negate that?
Hard to say because it's there's a huge skill component, and there's definitely ring rust is certainly a condition, but he fights a lot. He's got a good team around him, and he's in the gym every night, boxing and doing kickboxing and wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and he's got a great team around him. So he's been practicing quite a bit. I understand that's not a fight, but he's certainly conditioned and experienced and has the skill. His skills are honed. So again, our biggest concern is do you add the weight and does it decrease your speed and power? And he's demonstrated that in fact it's increased his speed and power. So I'm bullish in terms of his physical performance, and we'll just see if he's able to execute in the ring with with not having fought in a long time, if he'll have the same instincts that we've all known Jon. He's always been known to have that ring IQ, and we'll see if he can still execute that.
And one of my friends has actually just texted me right now. I told him I was interviewing you with regards to Jon Jones, and his first question, his first comment back to it was, "How much did John bench?" That's all he wants to know. How much did Jon Jones bench? So, wait, you were with him. You were with him in the training room. How much did he bench?
Yeah, he would pretty consistently bench over 300 pounds.
Wow.
And, we didn't focus necessarily on the top weight. Again, we weren't powerlifting. We would put bands on it and see how quickly he could move it, how quickly he could move heavy weight. That was our goal is again, power. And there's a strength speed component to that. And so, but every now and then he wanted to go up and touch a heavy weight. He was benching over 300 pounds.
Wow, that's very impressive. Uh,
Especially with those arms.
I was about to say he's got long and skinny arms like me, but obviously muscle size
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily translate to power. Stan, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Are there any plugs that you want to make? Obviously, the vertical diet is your big thing, probably one of the biggest things that you've been known as since the powerlifting career has come to an end. Is there anything else you'd like to plug?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody needs any more information about all the things that we discussed, I put it in a very comprehensive 225-page ebook called The Vertical Diet, 3.0 ebook. And everything's at stanefferding.com, whether it's my meal prep company or my ebook, Instagram, Stan Efferding, and YouTube. I have a host of rants on YouTube that are good educational material. And that's also Stan Efferding.
And final question: are you going to be at the fight in 4 weeks' time?
Oh, yeah, it's here in Vegas. I'm going to be there.
Fair enough. I'm heading out to Vegas there for it as well, so I'll see you there.
Awesome. Thank
Great.
you, brother, for having me. I
Thank you very
appreciate
much
it.
for the time. I really appreciate it.